video about conventions in Kentucky, Missouri, and Washington, and to observe what happened and what could have been different. Well, in the first one, Kentucky, now these are all anywhere from, I think the longest one was 9 minutes, and one was 3 minutes, and one was maybe 4 minutes. So they were quite short, and they were just pieces, clearly, of state convention meetings for these 3 states. And how many actually saw them?
I got the Kentucky one.
Yeah.
I watched that one.
What was it, Kentucky? What was the other 2?
Missouri and Washington. Well, let's go through them one at a time. The first one was Kentucky. I could tell immediately that the chair of the meeting was very able, knew what he was doing. For one thing, he retained his calm. For another, he said, your motion is out of order. He never said the person was out of order, and that's always kind of a giveaway on a chair. If the chair says you are out of order, then you know that they're probably not as experienced, because they should say your motion or your point is out of order. It started off nicely enough. The delegate read from the rules and objected to a specific rule and gave the reason and moved to amend. There he, and this is a brown sheet thing, he was not specific particularly about what it was. He was giving a kind of a conceptual amendment rather than a specific. If he had said, I move to strike out in Rule 14 the words yada, 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 and instead insert, he would have been better off, because then it would have been very specific what he was talking about. He'd made his point very well, but he did not move really to amend specifically enough. So always remember that. You can't just say, I move to amend, so that it doesn't say that it's such and such. You actually have to say, I move to amend Rule 8 by striking out the words, etc. The chair then said something about, well, this was already adopted by unanimous consent. But then apparently someone corrects the chair in an aside, and he said, well, oh, I guess that's right. But then he says, well, the 5 minutes for the discussion with the Rules Committee is already passed. And he goes ahead and takes the vote on the adoption of the rules. Well, the people who are unhappy, and there are quite a few unhappy people on this, are so busy being unhappy that they don't do the obvious thing, which is to vote no very loudly. They're still saying point of order, instead of saying he's taking the vote, vote no. But they don't. And the delegates are continuing to say point of order. He has to recognize a point of order. And the chair says, I have made a ruling. And the delegates continue to say point of order. And then another way we know that the chair is experienced is because the chair says, do you wish to appeal? Well, you see, they don't know what appeal is. So he very clearly asks the delegates that. Nobody responds. They're still saying point of order, when they should have said what? Yes, because that's exactly what they wanted. They did want to appeal the ruling of the chair. They wanted to appeal the fact that he said it was time for the vote. And so if they had said yes, he would have explained why he did what he did. Someone else, then other people could speak, no person speaking more than twice. Then at the end, he would have spoken again, and then he could have said, do you wish to sustain the decision of the chair? Now they would have had a situation where possibly they still would have lost, but now it would have been a majority plus one of everybody in the room who was saying, we agree with what he did, instead of just the chair. So that's the advantage of the appeal. You get a vote from everyone. And that's where it ends. But as I say, the chair indicated that he knew clearly what he was doing, but the delegates did not. And so they lost on several opportunities where they could have had their say. In Missouri, the chair was clearly not as confident. The chair was not. And he had a delegate who really knew what he was doing, very clearly. And when the person called point of order, the chair ignored it. Now, that's a sign, too, of the chair who is not so confident. Because if you're confident, and we'll see this in the last one, the chair asks, what's your point? And that's what the chair should have done. And you'll see later on how very much that is what the chair should have done. But he just keeps ignoring this fellow who's clearly standing in the middle of the group, saying, point of order, point of order. And the chair ignores it. And the delegate says, I appeal from the decision of the chair. So he says what he wants. The chair continues to ignore it and tries to go on taking the vote, at which point the delegate makes the motion to declare the chair vacant. And as we know, it says in Roberts that if the officer, the presiding officer, continues to ignore you, will not call on you, you have the right to conduct the meeting yourself. So he does that. It's a really, for a parliamentarian, it's just a classic. I have seen this done, but very few times. But he was so comfortable with himself, and he says, I move to declare the chair vacant. All those in favor of declaring the chair vacant, say aye. Those opposed. And meanwhile, the fellow who's chairing is still trying to plow through, take this vote. Now he's calling for the sergeant at arms. He wants the fellow removed. And finally, he says, belatedly, all right, what's your point? Now the meeting is now thrown into this big commotion, big mess. You know what the fellow's point was? That they had not voted first in the meeting on the adoption of the rules. To which, of course, the chair says, point well taken. So he created all of this mess because the chair was not competent in terms of accepting right away, what is your point? State your point.
Right to it.
And then he would have said, oh, of course, it's one of the things you must do when you begin a meeting, is one of the first things you have to do is determine, do you have a quorum present? A quorum being present, let's adopt the rules for the meeting. And as we said, your regular organizations that meet monthly, you don't adopt rules. Those are rules that you adopt maybe once a year, or you just have them ongoing for the 2 years of the term, whatever it is. But anytime you have a convention type meeting, you adopt specific rules for that meeting. And he was quite right. So by the way, so he says, oh, of course, you're right. We should have done that. And then he takes the vote, but he does forget the chair does not ask for discussion. And I think by this time the chair is quite flustered. Didn't you get that feeling where he was thinking, I'd rather be someplace else?